Hey boss, I pulled one out of the archives for you.
The best TV shows and movies are the ones where characters are faced with moral quandaries that explore the gray area between good and evil. People like to imagine what they would do in those situations and can easily see themselves on either side.
Yeah, people's day-to-day choices can be hard to morally quantify. Life is messy, and the world is broken. So often we're not even given a clear choice between right and wrong. We just have to do what we have to do to survive and get ahead in this ill society.
No boss. That's not what he's talking about.
In real life though, we fit people into black and white categories. A decision is either right or wrong, and someone is either good or evil. We often want to categorize people so much that we'll create a fictionalized version of that person in order to shove them into one of those two boxes. Christopher Columbus is one of those people.
What? Who's looking back at the era of aggressive colonialism and saying, yeah, I could see myself on either side of that issue?
You probably have one of two views of Columbus. You might think that he was a brave explorer who proved the world was round and by doing so discovered the United States, and if that's the case, congratulations on graduating from elementary school.
Oh, no. You don't come onto my internet and condescend me. I condescend you, okay? I condescend you.
Wait, boss, it gets so much worse than this.
I condescend to you.
Oh my god.
But odds are you probably think,
Columbus was an incompetent buffoon who never even set foot in America.
Christopher Columbus was actually an idiot and dum-dum.
He got lost coming here, and he's the one that named us Indians because he thought he was in India.
He was a doofus who was terrible at math.
Yes! I'm one of history's greatest monsters!
well, that's quite the contrast.
Are you really going to make me defend Adam ruins everything?
Yeah, that's where we're at now.
I will never forgive you for this.
Let's take a look at the facts and see if we can't figure out which ones have been misunderstood, misattributed, exaggerated, and sometimes straight up fabricated.
Well, this is gonna be a complete mess. Before we get started, this Knowing Better video that I'm responding to has been unlisted and was replaced with a follow-up video that better explains the history of Columbus. It might seem petty to reply to a 5-year-old video that's currently unlisted, but the fact that I could still find this so easily is a huge problem. He should have deleted this video a long time ago, and I think that the only reason he hasn't is because he's too proud to give up the over 3 million views that it accumulated. But what's worse is that his follow-up video doesn't even address the biggest problems with this unlisted video, and at least once he straight up lies.
I want to start this off by saying we should get rid of Columbus Day. We should start celebrating Indigenous Peoples Day. That has always been my position.
That's the follow-up video, but in the original video he said,
I personally don't think that we should have a day to celebrate him. But conversely, I also disagree with just renaming it Indigenous Peoples Day, because what is it really? It's just anti-Columbus Day. Think about it. What do people do on Indigenous Peoples Day? They hate Columbus, burn him in effigy, and hold mock trials of him. Don't just name swap it and make it hate on Columbus Day.
And this clear contradiction, along with a few other statements that he made in his follow-up video, make it pretty clear that he simply doesn't want to own up to the mistakes that he made in his original upload. I want to show what the human brain looks like on indoctrination. Knowing Better's video is a really good example of how your ego can block you from accepting reality, protecting you from uncomfortable truths from which you are currently benefiting. And the fact that Knowing Better didn't want to address these issues in his follow-up video makes it pretty obvious that he is indoctrinated, and his ego is protecting him from accepting the fact that he's benefiting from a Eurocentric mindset that has a stranglehold on Aboriginal culture. Happy Indigenous Peoples Day.
Columbus couldn't have discovered that the Earth was round because in his time it was already common knowledge.
The way Adam phrases this makes it seem like Columbus thought he was the first person to conclude that the world is round. He didn't, nor did he ever claim to. This is what Columbus was aiming for, Cipangu, which is supposed to be Japan. Obviously, this isn't where Japan really is, but that is where everyone thought it was. It wasn't Columbus's calculation of the distance that was off. It was any educated person's positioning of Japan. Columbus was also hoping that there would be uncharted islands off of the east coast of Japan. So when he landed here, that's what he thought he found. Globes weren't exactly common back then. In fact, this is the oldest surviving globe in the world, made in 1493, completely separate from Columbus.
I don't want to focus on this too much because this is not what the video is about. Humans have known since at least the Greco-Roman period that the Earth was a globe. But as far as we know, Columbus was the first person in modern history to demonstrate that that's true.
Columbus landed on the island of Hispaniola, which is 7,000 miles away from Japan. That's where they got that number. So I suppose he got kind of lucky that he accidentally discovered some new land.
That's an uncomfortable way of putting it. Lucky for whom? Lucky in what way, exactly? Lucky for the Spanish monarchy who made bank off of the discovery through the and pillaging of the peoples in the land? Is that what you mean by lucky? Oh god, that made me want to throw up. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is what I mean by indoctrination. At no point during this video nor his follow-up video is Knowing Better even willing to entertain the idea that it was a bad thing that Europeans came over to America. This breaks the entire premise of his opening statement about Columbus being a moral gray area. He just frames the European discovery of the Americas as necessarily good just so that he has something against which he can weigh morally reprehensible things. He almost entirely begs the question on the positive benefits of this.
He didn't discover America, and he didn't prove the Earth was round.
This is something that you've heard everywhere, and it's probably already down in the comments. Whenever Adam says America, he's specifically referring to the United States, which is weird.
No, that's not what Adam's saying at all.
I personally have a problem with people who say that the Vikings discovered America first.
What Adam was saying is that Columbus could not have discovered America because there were already people living there. In fact, when Adam literally says that in his video, instead of addressing that point, Knowing Better instead throws up a nitpick about the population number being wrong.
If you don't count the 250,000 Taino people that live there already.
Occupied? Someone lives here?
Who gives a f if Adam is wrong about the population number? The point he's making is that people were already there. By continuously refusing to address this, Knowing Better is essentially refusing to acknowledge the Aboriginal population as equal to the Europeans and is dehumanizing them. This is why he thinks it's a good thing that Columbus discovered land, because he doesn't give a f about how the natives feel about it. Aboriginals aren't even real people to him. And I know it's harsh for me to say that about Knowing Better, but if you pay attention to the way that he talks about natives in this video, you'll start to understand what I'm getting at here.
The Vikings didn't discover America first. They stumbled on it looking for timber, stayed for a year, and then left. And not only did they never come back, but they just plain forgot about it. Their find amounted to nothing. Columbus's discovery, on the other hand, opened up both halves of the world to each other and changed world history forever.
Open up both sides of the world to each other? What the f are you talking about? The only reason that the Aboriginal population was interested in trading with the Europeans at all is because they were under the false premise that it was going to be fair and equal trade, that Europeans were going to treat Aboriginals with respect. The native population didn't get excited about being able to travel to Europe, and the vast majority of Aboriginals that traveled to Europe did so against their will. This is what I mean that he frames the discovery of America as a universally good thing that was beneficial to everyone involved. This is a lie. Columbus's discovery cannot possibly be framed as opening up both sides of the world to each other. It began a very one-sided relationship that very clearly benefited one side and was very clearly detrimental to the other.
On his third voyage in 1498, he landed here, which he named the Gulf of Paria, and then he named all of this Paria. This is the terrestrial paradise that he was talking about in that previous letter. He describes that the land of Paria is a mighty continent that was hitherto unknown. So not only did he know he found something new, but he was describing the South American continent. He thought that the Caribbean as well as this new continent lied to the southeast of Asia.
I just wanted to point out how this completely contradicts something that he says about Columbus not believing that he's in India, because Columbus said that he thought he was in the southeast of Asia, and India is in the southeast of Asia, and Europeans back then just called all Southeast Asians Indians, so that's why he thought he was in India. It's like almost nothing he says in this video is correct.
So now that we've cleared all that up, kind of, and we're in America, we need to discuss how primitive or not primitive the Native Americans were.
Oh god, this is when his seams really start to come undone.
People on both sides tend to lump all Native Americans in together. They're two huge continents spanning thousands of miles. What's true for one tribe isn't necessarily true for another. If one tribe mapped all the stars and created an almanac, that doesn't mean they all did. If one tribe didn't use the wheel, that doesn't mean they all didn't.
Alright, but they weren't just tribes. Even with just a cursory knowledge of native history, you'd understand that natives were broken up into nations. A tribe is just what you would call an individual group. The Americas weren't just covered with hundreds of tribes that had no connection to each other. There were specific language groups, and they even had ways to communicate with members of other nations that didn't speak the same language. This is where sign language comes from. The Aboriginals of the Americas invented it.
Some of them did invent a wheel. They just didn't use them for hauling because they hadn't domesticated draft animals yet.
I would have been fine with that statement until he said the word yet. This implies that given enough time, they would have eventually, when no, they wouldn't have. Ever.
Well, la-de frickin' da! Hey, Dad, I can't see real good. Is that Bill Shakespeare over there?
There is no way in hell that you could possibly know that the Aboriginals of the Americas would never have domesticated the buffalo. They had domesticated animals, even pack animals such as llamas and emus, and it was only a matter of time before they domesticated something larger.
Not because they're intellectually inferior or anything like that, but because they had a really difficult spawn point.
Please do not devolve into using video game logic for something like this. Knowing better is supposed to be a professional teacher, and he talks about these issues like he's a third grader writing a book report.
There are no draft animals or work or pack animals in the Americas. There are no horses, donkeys, or camels.
Those are not the only animals in the universe that can do those things. The draft animals that we used were not automatically conceived into nature exactly the way that we use them on farms today. Livestock's features are altered through selective breeding to create optimal work animals with ideal features. Besides, your point is irrelevant. The indigenous North Americans could have chosen to never domesticate anything larger, and that would not have invalidated their culture. They still deserve to exist, and they still deserve to be left alone. Domesticating beasts of burden is not a requirement to being a sovereign people. This is such a weird line of logic.
And because of that, they hit somewhat of a cap on their civilization tech tree.
Alright, the video game references are cute and everything, but he's using them as a form of dishonesty. What knowing better is doing here is implying that it is necessary for a human civilization to evolve and develop a specific way. Again, he's not even entertaining the idea that it's okay for a civilization not to develop work animals. He's implying that Aboriginals of the Americas were developmentally stunted, and because of that, we should see them as inferior. He's implying that they should not be seen as equal humans when he said that the natives were primitive.
We need to discuss how primitive or not primitive the Native Americans were.
He wasn't just using that as a colloquial term. He meant that Aboriginals are not as good as Europeans. Real life is just like some sort of a role-playing game, and because Europeans had filled out more of their tech tree that Europeans were somehow winning the game. So more or less he's implying that it was inevitable for the Aboriginals to get overtaken by Europeans and that they deserved to be conquered. I can't believe that I actually have to say this to a grown-ass adult, but life is not a video game. Civilizations are not required to develop a specific way in order to be considered valid, and a relatively advanced civilization does not have the duty nor the right to conquer a less advanced civilization. Throughout his entire video, this is the only argument that Knowing Better makes to support his claim that it was a good thing that Columbus discovered new land. You, sir, are an imbecile.
You can't really have large cities without animals.
Oh,
You can't really have large cities without animals.
there were dozens of enormous cities here before Columbus landed. Some so incredible that they could be considered technological marvels. And honestly, I'm not even remotely surprised that the American education system does not include information like this in their curriculum, because they don't even want you to understand how Aboriginals lived before Europeans got here. But you need to get your head out of your education curriculum and just look at the things that they've discovered recently. In 2018, scientists using LiDAR discovered a massive lost Mayan city that at its most conservative estimate would have been home to 10 million people. Likely many more than that.
With the exception of llamas and guinea pigs in Peru, they didn't have any domesticated animals.
Wrong. They domesticated wolves and dogs, foxes, reindeer, falcons, and even the occasional black bear.
There were no cows, pigs, or chickens to share diseases with, so Native Americans were incredibly vulnerable and susceptible to disease.
If anything, you're making an argument that Europeans should have just left the natives alone.
Native Americans were incredibly vulnerable and susceptible to disease. Again, not because of any genetic inferiority, but because of their difficult starting location.
Oh my god, you have to stop that. Again, you're just implying that the Aboriginals should have to want to be part of the world stage. That they should have to want to compete on the same level as Europeans. That the Aboriginals should have to want to be technologically equal to the rest of the world. This is bigoted. You're being bigoted. And this is why someone like Knowing Better would want to defend Columbus. Because they agree with the premise that Europe was right to bully the Aboriginal population into being part of the European vision of the world. This is why Knowing Better doesn't address what the native population's opinion of colonization was. Because he's assuming the premise that colonialization is necessarily a good thing, that the Eurocentric mindset deserves to conquer the world. This is the most disgusting shit. You're being a bully.
Since Europeans and Asians had been living in close proximity with animals for centuries, they had built up somewhat of an immunity to animal diseases, like cowpox, chickenpox, and the various swine and avian flus. So on Columbus's second voyage, when smallpox was introduced to the New World, it burned through the entire continent, killing 90% of the Native American population before they had even heard of a European. This was inevitable and unavoidable.
The smallpox hypothesis was merely one of many different theories levied to explain why the native population was so small when later groups of Europeans arrived on the continent. And most historians don't really take that hypothesis seriously today. Even if you're right, all you're really doing is demonstrating why Europeans never should have come to the Americas in the first place.
By 1600, 90% of the native population had died, so when the first North American colonists showed up in 1607 and 1620, They found most of the land to be pretty much uninhabited. Pre-Columbian population numbers for North America vary widely, from 50 to 100 million. But everyone pretty much agrees on that 90% disease mortality number, so we're talking about 5 to 10 million people in 1600s spread across the entire continent. Before you go thinking that that's exceptionally bad, remember that 150 years before Columbus, Europe lost 50 to 60% of its population to the Black Plague. These epidemics just kind of happened. This was inevitable and unavoidable.
What he's trying to argue here is that Columbus couldn't be that bad of a guy because he personally didn't kill 90% of the native population. And that is a garbage argument. He's pretending that it was simply disease, which was out of his hands. He couldn't control that. But the truth is that Columbus and the men under his employ were directly responsible for murdering and killing through capital punishment. But the unfortunate fact that we have to deal with here is that the native population declined rapidly after it was discovered by Columbus. And smallpox was one guess that has never been demonstrated to be true. So it's way more likely that the population declined because Columbus began a precedence of slaughtering natives, separating them from their culture and their land, and forced them to live in conditions they were not used to. So spin that however you want, but the native population declined directly because of the acts of Columbus and his regime. Period.
If you don't count the 250,000 Taino people that live there already.
Occupied? Someone lives here?
Right, I know this part. He thought he made it to India. What a silly mistake.
Yes, if by silly you mean brutal.
Brutal is not a synonym for silly.
He knows that. He's making a point. Oh my god, you actually are making me defend Adam Ruins Everything.
I'm sorry, boss. I'm sorry.
The Taino treated Columbus and his crew with the utmost hospitality.
Hug?
On his first trip, he bounced around a few islands, left 40 people to set up a fort, and returned home to report his findings. The king and queen sent him back after only 6 months with the expressed purpose of establishing more permanent settlements. So what did Columbus think when he first saw the natives?
Did enslave and brutalize the nice people he found. There are journal entries literally from him describing the natives being kind and bringing them things, having no knowledge of guns so they'd be easy to enslave.
Okay, that is a lot to unpack. But this is something that people bring up all the time, that in his own words and in his own journals, he says this or that. The most common quotes are the ones he shows.
Now we're getting into the slavery and genocide portion of the video. You're gonna want to make sure you're sitting down for this part.
Let's start with this one about them making good servants. What do you notice about this quote? How about the fact that it's neither the beginning nor the end of the sentence? There's clearly more to it. So we're gonna have to look it up. And here it is. It appears to me that the people are ingenious and would be good servants, and I am of the opinion that they would very readily become Christians, as they appear to have no religion. They very quickly learn such words as are spoken to them. In full context, the word servant could mean slave, or servant of God, or subject of the crown. When they just cut out the ingenious good servant part, it only means slave. They remove any context and any doubt.
Okay, but look at the context of what he means by that. He's not saying, hey, maybe we can convince them of their own free will to choose to work for the crown. He's saying we can make them work for us. He's not implying that there would be any choice involved in this at all. And when he's saying we can convert them to Christianity, he's not saying that they will love to follow the laws of the church. He's saying we can alter their way of life in such a way that they'll no longer be offensive savages in the eyes of our delicate European sensibilities. He's literally saying we will put them to work and make them subservient to our culture. What he's literally saying is that they would be easy to conquer. He's telling the King of Spain that they will be conquered.
But these are Columbus's own words. We have to take them at face value since we can't figure out what he really meant. Right? Do you see where I'm going with this yet? These aren't his own words, because his real name wasn't Christopher Columbus, it was Cristoforo Colombo.
No. You can't just say, oh, he spoke old world Spanish or Italian or some and then that means we don't actually know what he meant because context is different. All we have to do is match the words he said with the actions he performed. We can tell what he meant based on what he did after he said those words. And history recorded what he did. So there's no mystery. We can't play like mystery word game here. Columbus made it very clear what he meant with his actions.
Here's what we're looking for from October 11, 1492. Now we have to translate it. Let's just shove it into Google Translate and see what we get. They must be good servants and of good wit that I see that very quickly he says everything he told them blah blah.
Are you kidding me with this shit? This is like the laziest thing I've ever seen in my life. Google Translate can't decipher old world colloquialisms and euphemisms.
It takes some linguistic gymnastics to get from they must be good servants and of good wit to the people are ingenious and would be good servants. They picked the absolute worst, most biased translation to quote as journal entries literally from him.
This straight up just doesn't even deserve a response.
There is another one people like to refer to. I could conquer the whole of them with 50 men and govern them as I please. Here's the Spanish, and here's what Google Translate says. Because with 50 men they are all subjugated, and it will make them do everything they want? Okay, that ending doesn't really make all that much sense, but I can tell you what it doesn't say. Conquer them and govern them as I please.
This may very well be the dumbest thing I've ever responded to. It's up there, man.
But just to be sure, let's look at a different translation of the same quote. For with 50 men they can all be subjugated and made to do what is required of them. The words conquer or govern don't appear here either. Again, they picked the worst possible translation to highlight.
Are you kidding me? This is your positive example? He's saying all I need is 50 men to subjugate them and make them do what is required of them. Make them do. Make them means force them. And just think about it. Why do you need 50 men for this if they're choosing to be subjects? Why do you need 50 men if they are choosing to be part of Europe? Because it's not a choice. 50 men have swords and muskets. 50 men with whips and paddles. If anything, the example that you're using as positive makes it even more clear that they're meant to be slaves.
In full context, in this section, Columbus is asking the king and queen what they want done with the natives, suggesting that 50 men would be all that's required to hold the island.
Yeah. He's asking the king and queen because they're the king and queen. You don't tell the king and queen what to do, you ask them if this is what they want.
None of Columbus's original journals survive. All we have are transcriptions of his journal written by someone who's probably already been mentioned in the comments below. Bartolomé de las Casas. Bartolomé de las Casas was a noble who was given an encomienda in the New World. Encomienda was the Spanish feudal system of lords and peasants. And that's what the natives were. Peasants, not slaves. Columbus wanted to subjugate them, which means turn them into subjects of the crown, not enslave them. They were forced to work against their will, but nobody owned them.
What am I listening to?
They were forced to work against their will. They were forced to work against their will. They were forced to work against their will, but nobody owned them.
You're just playing stupid word games to try to win your point on a technicality. You spent like 5 minutes trying to say that subjects doesn't mean subjugated, and after all that you admit that they didn't get a choice.
This is something that people bring up all the time, that in his own words and in his own journals he says this or that. The most common quotes are the ones he shows. I could conquer the whole of them with 50 men and govern them as I please. And here's what Google Translate says. Because with 50 men they are all subjugated and it will make them do everything they want? Okay, that ending doesn't really make all that much sense, but I can tell you what it doesn't say. Conquer them and govern them as I please, and they can all be subjugated and made to do what is required of them. The words conquer or govern don't appear here either. Columbus wanted to subjugate them, which means turn them into subjects of the crown, not enslave them. They were forced to work against their will.
Servants under the feudal system is worse than slaves. Because the very fact that a slave is considered property means that a slave has some level of rights and protections. lands. But a land servant under the feudal system has none. They're considered a part of the property, meaning the property owner can hurt them and kill them and work them to death, and he receives no punishment. So it would be more accurate to compare their working conditions to that of a labor camp or a concentration camp. This is why I say that people that defend Columbus are heartless monsters. The Aboriginals were a conquered people who were forced to work themselves to death against their will. It's irrelevant if anyone owned them.
In 1515, Las Casas gave up his encomienda and advocated instead for the use of African slaves. That's right, the protector of the natives, as he would later be called, advocated for the transatlantic slave trade, which then started under Nicolas de Ovando, not Columbus.
Yeah, two reasons for that. One, because African slaves already had built up immunities to most European diseases, so they'd die less often. And two, the transatlantic slave trade became an industry. He was lobbying to begin an industry, meaning people would make money off of the selling and trading of slaves. He's a real freaking hero. This is the point in the discussion where it becomes relevant that over 90% of the native population had died off, when they could no longer feasibly use them as slave labor. He didn't propose this because he gives a about the Aboriginals. Because if you look at what actually functionally happened during this time, the Europeans were replacing native slaves with African slaves. This wasn't done to save Aboriginals, this was done to repopulate their numbers with an outside labor force. This served as yet another way that the Europeans took the natives' land away from them, further delegitimizing the Aboriginals' claim to the American land, further removing their sovereignty from their territory. I think the key point that Knowing Better is trying to make here,
the protector of the natives, as he would later be called, advocated for the transatlantic slave trade, which then started under Nicolas de Ovando, not Columbus.
He's trying to say that Columbus was not the one that began the transatlantic slave trade, even though people record him as being the first. And though technically Columbus didn't start it, Columbus was the first person in human history to cram hundreds of people into the belly of a ship and send it across the Atlantic, proving that mass slave trade was possible across the Atlantic. And Columbus did this not knowing if any of the slaves would survive the trip. So bringing this up doesn't make Columbus seem any less evil. If anything, it solidifies him as one of the most evil human beings in history. So yes, Columbus didn't prove that the earth is round, but he did prove that we could send hundreds if not thousands of slaves across the Atlantic and make a viable business out of that. Wow. So many statues of this guy.
Columbus was removed as governor of Hispaniola in 1500 and put in jail, not because of his brutal treatment of the natives, but because of his mismanagement of the colony, which meant that he wasn't extracting enough gold, and because of complaints from the Spanish colonists.
Cut off people's noses and hands unless they give you silver, right?
He was doing that to the Spanish. I'm sure he also did that to the natives, but the king and queen didn't really care about the natives at this point. But it was while he was arrested that he wrote an important letter.
Girls as young as 9 years old were sold into sexual slavery.
My customers wanted New World sex slaves, and I heard them.
Actual Christopher Columbus quote.
That actual Christopher Columbus quote comes from that important letter I just mentioned, where he complains about the robbing and sexual slavery of natives, which is why he cut off colonists' hands and noses.
Columbus did not get in trouble for maiming Spanish colonists. That's a lie. He was getting in trouble because the entire colony got out of hand, because it was being ruled by a mindless tyrant. But why don't you go ahead and read that letter for a second?
And that the violence of the calumny of turbulent persons has injured me more than my services have profited me, which is a bad example for the present and the future. Am I saying that Columbus was a good person? No. But am I saying that he was against the very thing that people say he was for? Yes, that's exactly what I'm saying. Yes.
Yeah, don't you understand the context of this letter? He's complaining that his reputation has been ruined by the barbaric acts committed by the colonists. He's throwing them under the bus, saying that he had no control over them and their actions made him look bad. But he was the one in charge of them, meaning it was up to him to stop them from doing those things. So likely, the reason they were doing those things is because he had set the precedence to allow that to happen. Just because nobody caught Columbus doing those things doesn't mean he wasn't the one doing them. In fact, Columbus and his friends all recorded instances where Columbus gifted people, young women and girls, as a sign of friendship. Columbus even made a regular habit of visiting multiple islands on his trips, stealing multiple women and girls off of those islands. And you're trying to tell us that nothing bad happened to those women? You're trying to say that that wasn't a nefarious act? Columbus was disgusting.
They're quoting his complaint about something happening and saying he was doing it. Talk about taking something out of context.
The problem here is that he didn't write this letter to the king and queen before his arrest. He wrote these correspondence after he was already put in custody. He wasn't complaining about something he was observing at the time. He wasn't bringing an issue to light. He was complaining about it after he already got caught.
None of Columbus's original journals survive. All we have are transcriptions of his journal written by someone who's probably already been mentioned in the comments below, Bartolomé de las Casas. So Columbus was not governor when Las Casas arrived. Las Casas had already given up his encomienda and started the slave trade by the time he transcribed Columbus's journals. So at this point, he has every incentive to make Columbus look as bad as possible. In fact, it's common knowledge that he paraphrased and exaggerated.
Okay, so you're arguing that because Christopher Columbus's writings were transcribed by another person, that we shouldn't trust them, even though there's only a 40-year difference. This is just complete bizarre nonsense. Knowing better pulls this nefarious motivation completely out of thin air here. If you want to assert that Columbus's own writings were altered to make him look bad, you have to demonstrate that with some level of evidence. But Las Casas goddamn near worshipped Columbus. He looked up to him. He went as far as to say that he was chosen by God to discover the Americas. Why would Las Casas say something so venerative of Columbus and then turn around and completely alter Columbus's own works to make him look bad? Is it not just possible that Columbus was a bad person? That's like 1,000 times more likely.
This is made even worse by Black Legend, which is a propaganda campaign by English historians to make the Spanish look much worse than they really were.
Buddy. It says alleged. See right there on the screen where it says alleged? Yeah, that means it's not real. The Black Legend is some spin doctory bullshit that Spanish fascists invented to whitewash the Spanish atrocities committed by Spanish people during Spanish history. Alright, this is just Spanish fascist propaganda.
So when people say from Columbus's own journals, what they really mean is from one specific 1892 English translation of the 1530 transcripts of Columbus's journals, originally written 40 years earlier. I hate to draw this comparison, but it's kind of like directly quoting Jesus.
God, please don't bring Jesus into this.
He didn't speak English. What you're actually reading is a centuries-old translation of a third-person account of what he said, written hundreds of years afterwards.
Yeah, written hundreds of years later by people who never met him. Las Casas was Columbus's biggest fanboy and was the first person to follow directly in his footsteps. It's not at all a fair comparison. And the people transcribing Jesus's work weren't trying to make him look bad. This is just a sloppy analogy.
Columbus's regime was so senselessly brutal that by 1542, the Taino population on the island had fallen to 200.
As we've already established, Columbus's regime only lasted until 1500. Adam is attributing an entire 50-year span to one person, 42 of which weren't even under Columbus.
It would be fair to try to separate Columbus's actions with all the brutality that happened after him if you could demonstrate that what happened after Columbus left was actually worse than what Columbus did. However, after Columbus left, the conditions for Aboriginal slaves actually improved. If anything, individual acts of brutality against natives declined after Columbus was replaced. It's fair to say that it was his regime that did it because he's the one that began the precedents for the treatment of Aboriginal slaves. He's the one that got the ball rolling on the genocide. He's the one that began the system of removing natives from their homes and cultures and forcing them to work in inhumane conditions. Before Columbus was there, no natives were slaves and no natives were brutalized. After Columbus arrived, that happened constantly. So who else do you blame for that?
So how many people did Columbus and his men kill, and does that count as genocide? If we take that 250,000 number and subtract the 90% mortality rate from disease, the answer is that it doesn't matter. That's not what genocide means. In 2012, George Zimmerman shot and killed Trayvon Martin. That fact is beyond dispute, but he was found innocent. How is that possible? Because he was tried for murder, not manslaughter. Murder requires an intent to kill. Zimmerman didn't leave his house that morning saying, I'm gonna kill a black kid today.
Did you seriously just put a justification for the Trayvon Martin murder in the middle of this video? Did you seriously just defend George Zimmerman in the middle of this fucking video? Like, oh my god, I have to change gears for a second. Okay, Trayvon Martin was murdered. That was murder. But George Zimmerman got away with it, not because it was manslaughter, not because they charged him with the wrong thing. He got off on a technicality because of the stupid stand your ground law. Like, read the freaking articles on it, for Christ's sake.
Proving intent when the only witness is the perpetrator is nearly impossible, and intent matters when we're trying to define a crime. So when we look at what happened with Columbus and his men, there's no denying that mass killings took place. I am not trying to deny, excuse, or minimize what happened.
What the f are you talking about? That's the entire point of this video, is you're minimizing the severity of Columbus's acts. Like, are we watching the same thing? I'm losing my mind.
But when trying to label the crime as genocide, we have to look at the intent. Genocide, as defined by the UN, is an act committed with intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group. Columbus's intent was not to
wipe them out. All of them.
And now you're using a Star Wars meme to justify native genocide. I'm not convinced that you understand the severity of this subject matter.
In his own words, he wanted to subjugate them. It wasn't racially or ethnically motivated, it was conquest motivated, and those who resisted were killed.
That's literally describing genocide. Genocide cannot be so simply summed up as the death of every single member of an ethnic group. Genocide is not just an end result, genocide is an act. It was members of one specific ethnic group, the Aboriginals of the Americas, and his intent was to subjugate them all. And in your own words, that included converting them all to Christianity and forcing them to live in labor camps, separated from their land and removed from their cultural traditions. Rounding up an entire ethnic group, denying their original culture and forcing them to adopt a new one is literally genocide. It doesn't matter if he intended for all of them to die. The fact of the matter is that before Columbus got here, the Americas were a completely different place, and there were a vast multitude of Aboriginal cultures. And then after Columbus got here, America just became Europe 2.0, and the natives became a broken, scattered people completely removed from their original culture. And that genocide didn't just end in the 1600s. Here in Canada, the Catholic Church and the Canadian government continued to round up Native children well into the 1950s, forced them to live in boarding schools where they cut their hair, taught them westernized culture, and punished them for trying to maintain any level of connection to their original culture. Genocide is not just guns and swords and death, it's the erasure of an entire people's way of life. This is exactly what the CCP is doing to the Uyghur population inside of China, and this is exactly what the Russians are doing to the Ukrainians in their occupied territory. It doesn't matter if their intention is for all of them to die. All that matters is that the aggressor is intending to assimilate an entire ethnic culture into their own, and that they're using any means to hinder that other ethnic culture from existing. I cannot believe that you're trying to liken the European genocide of the Aboriginals of the Americas with manslaughter. Millions of natives died to make the new world that you live in today. And the lucky few that got to survive were removed from their original cultural heritage. That is genocide. Look around. The Aboriginal population that's alive today, they wear t-shirts and jeans and sneakers. They speak English and often depend on government handouts to survive. They're policed, governed, and ruled by Western police forces and governments. They do not have sovereignty, they do not have freedom, and they're not living the way their ancestors lived. Their culture has been erased. Their ethnic uniqueness has been lost to history. And that is the Europeans' fault. That is Columbus's fault. Just because he wasn't alive long enough to create the end result does not mean that his acts were not themselves acts of genocide.
Truth is that Columbus and his imagined female goddess form Columbia have been part of the American story since the beginning. Here she is telling you to ration food during World War I, and here she is in the painting that you all know, even if you're not American, as the depiction of Manifest Destiny.
Manifest Destiny is just a shorthand way of saying that white people deserve to take land away from the natives because it was our destiny. I'm sorry, how is that? Weren't we talking about how this is not genocide? Manifest Destiny was one of the justifications that Hitler used to invade Europe and take everything away from the Jewish population. Manifest Destiny literally leads to concentration camps.
Admittedly, American folklore has probably turned him into a bigger deal than he should be given his rather minimal involvement in US history, which is why I personally don't think that we should have a day to celebrate him.
So you agree that we should not have a day to celebrate him, not because he's a monster, but because he's not really that big a deal. Holy shit, dude. This is such an uncomfortable video to listen to.
But conversely, I also disagree with just renaming it Indigenous Peoples Day, because what is it really?
F him. Yeah, f Columbus.
Christopher Columbus.
That's a big f you.
It's just anti-Columbus Day. Think about it. What do people do on Indigenous Peoples Day? They hate Columbus, burn him in effigy, and hold mock trials of him. If you want to have a day where we celebrate Native history and Native cultures, then let's do that. Don't just name swap it and make it hate on Columbus Day. We don't have a day where we hate on objectively more evil people like Hitler or Stalin. It's weird.
Man, your video is weird. Hating on Columbus on what used to be Columbus Day makes total sense. Just celebrating Aboriginal people on Aboriginal People's Day and pretending that Columbus has nothing to do with it is whitewashing history. Creating a happy, friendly, non-controversial celebration of Aboriginals is just denying their history. It's denying their current situation. It's denying what got them where they are today. We have to hate on Columbus because it's Columbus's fault that the Aboriginal population is suffering suffering today. If it weren't for Columbus, they would still have a connection to their original culture, they would not have been genocided, and they would be a sovereign people. They wouldn't have endured any of the atrocities that happened to them since white people got here. And it's absolutely disgusting that you would use native people to demonstrate your point about what Columbus Day is about, as if you're telling them to their face that they don't deserve to do what they want on their day.
Christopher Columbus.
Evil. Pure evil. I don't think we should have a holiday for it.
What are you, the holiday police? That's so offensive that you would throw their faces up on the screen and then tell them that they're wrong.
Was Columbus a good guy? No. Was he a bad guy? If we look at him through the historical lens, not really. He wasn't any worse than anyone else.
He wasn't worse than anyone else? Nobody in history had ever done what he did. Not before and not since. And not only was he brutal by today's standards, he had contemporaries, people alive at the same time as him, that criticized him for being too barbaric. How can you possibly say he's not worse than anyone else when he's worse than his own contemporaries? This makes no fucking sense.
To many people, Columbus deserves none of the credit for discovering America, but all of the blame for what happened to it. If we can pin 400 years of awful history onto one guy, it shifts all of the guilt for what happened to the Native Americans away from the rest of us. Well, the rest of you, because my relatives didn't come over until after the close of the Indian Wars, so not me.
And at the end of this show, with that line, he demonstrates his motivation for making this video. He just wants to pretend that because his family arrived after the worst of the atrocities, that he doesn't bear any guilt. He wants to spread the blame away not only from Columbus, but from himself. He doesn't want to take ownership for the guilt that he feels for benefiting from a system that rests on the backs of the natives from which we stole this land. He doesn't want to admit that he's benefiting from a system that resulted from genocide. He doesn't want to admit that the United States shouldn't exist and that this land should belong to the Aboriginal peoples of the Americas. He wants to wipe his hands clean of all the blood and just pretend that this is just the way it should be, because we're advanced on the tech tree and it was an inevitability that they would get conquered and subjugated for being a less developed people. This is your mind on indoctrination. This is what cognitive disconnect looks like. This is your mind on the American education system. None of this should have happened. None of this had to happen. But it did because the Europeans were arrogant. Because white people believed that they deserved this land and that Aboriginals are not real human beings. And everything that Knowing Better said in this video not only reinforced that narrative, but proved that he himself believes it. So in this year of 2023, I implore you on Aboriginal Peoples Day to think about how you may be holding on to these biases in your own mind, how you might cling on to justifications like this, simply so that you don't have to live with the guilt associated with acknowledging that this land belongs to the Aboriginals. You have to learn to accept that terrible things happen to the natives and that we're currently benefiting from a system that only exists because we took everything away from them, including their dignity. Happy Indigenous Peoples Day.